Welcome to the Rewrite Sessions. I'm Katie,
And I'm Ashley.
and this is a space for ambitious women who are questioning the rules that they inherited about things like success, work, and the lives that they are building. So every month, we're exploring a different theme through honest conversations, thoughtful reflection, and a closer look at what it might mean to do things a little bit differently. Today, we are exploring what might possibly be my favorite word right now, and that is the word audacity. So we're going to get into so much today, and I'm really excited to kickstart the conversation and pass it along to Ashley. But before we get started, I want to share the technical definition of audacity, because as you'll see probably through this conversation, there's a lot of different thoughts, interpretations, and really even connotations and meanings of this word. And that's actually one of the reasons we chose it. Okay, so let me read this aloud to you really quick. Audacity is a noun, and it defines a confident, daring, or bold quality, often possessing a negative connotation of being rude, shocking, or brazenly disrespectful. It represents a fearless, sometimes reckless disregard for personal safety, conventions, or social norms. The way that we hear it often, an example might be, I can't believe she had the audacity to do whatever. So like I mentioned, there's the negative connotations, which can be used to describe shocking rudeness, insolence, or contempt of law or moral restraint. On the other side, there's the positive connotations, which might be more bold. They can represent high confidence, resolution, or a daring, adventurous spirit. It is the dichotomy of those two words that we are slightly obsessed with over here. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this today. But Ashley, I know you've got some big thoughts that you can't wait to share about that definition and this word. And I can't wait to dive into it with you today.
Yeah, so when we were talking about doing this word, really what comes to mind is that example Katie said, where I can't believe she had the audacity to say that or to do that. It's almost those moments where you're like, did she or he really just say that? Like, I can't believe he just said that. And it brings up feelings of like people who are being rude or lacking awareness of their impact on other people. That kind of like, I don't give a you know what about how this is going to affect anyone else. I'm doing what I want. And just like a complete disregard for other people. That's what comes to mind when I hear that. At the same time, I feel like I've been hearing that word pop up a lot online in online communities about maybe we be a little bit more audacious and kind of challenging that. So it was something I think internally I struggled with a little bit because I'm like, well, I don't want to be more rude. And, I value being considerate of other people and I value emotional intelligence. And that word just kind of brings up those feelings, like people who are unfiltered and don't really care about their impact on others, basically. When I first really started exploring this word and what it could mean for me, I did have a little bit of reflection. And I feel like this is an area I'm pretty early on my journey in, meaning I don't have it all figured out. But I was kind of like journaling on it and thinking about it. And I think there is a big difference, though, of being inconsiderate and just not over considering. So, I talked about how I value being considerate of others. And then I'm like, wait, but sometimes, could you be over considering others? Like you're always just thinking about others and like you're so worried about what you say and how it might impact them. It almost kind of bleeds into a people pleasing component a little bit. So I feel like I am working to embrace more of that positive version of the word. And I think maybe it keeps people small sometime, it's breaking out of that shell and maybe saying the things that need to be said. And you can do that in a way that's not just brazen and rude, right? They may not want to hear it, but you can do it in a way. We've talked about kind of niceness versus kindness. You can do it in a way that's still respectful and that can still be audacious. So that's kind of my journey on that
Yeah.
a little bit.
And I think it's interesting because I think when I read those two definitions, it's like, in some cases, they're the same thing. It's like you're being bold. And if somebody doesn't like that, their perception is, oh, I can't believe she had the audacity to do that. But really, you're just being bold. You're saying what needs to be said. You're being direct. All these things that in a lot of cases we're expected to not do, right? Like we're expected to soften it, to be kind, or to be, people pleasing about it, to make sure we're doing it with regard for everybody else. And if you don't, then it's like you're instantly seen in this negative light, but really you're just being, again, direct, maybe a little bold, maybe a little risk taking, whatever. And it's funny because even when I say the sentence aloud, if you listen to like the way that you phrase it, or the way that your tone is, I should say, it has such a different meaning, right? So if you're like, I can't believe she had the audacity to do that. Or if you're like, I can't believe she had the audacity to do that. It's like, wow, like, cool, good for her. But I think we're so used to that first version of it that it's hard to realize, like, actually living with some audacity is pretty freaking cool. And it's pretty freaking bold to do things that make you uncomfortable because they help you grow. And actually, on that note, so Audacity is my word of the year for 2026. I chose it maybe back in November, December. Like Ashley said, I kept hearing it over and over, and it's something that I wanted to work on because I'm not always bold. I'm not always taking risks, definitely. And finding my voice specifically is something that's been a huge journey for me. And some of you may have heard a webinar that I did back in March, and it was all about finding my voice. And so I've been on this journey basically my whole life. But I think this is the first time where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take 2026 and I'm going to be deliberate about it. All these things I've been working on, I'm going to really kind of focus on living with more audacity. And so I love my girl ChatGPT and my girl Claude. I always call it a her or a she. And I did a lot of work to figure out like what I want this word to look like for me when it comes to my word of the year. And so we did the vision board together. We did all these things. But one of the things that came out of it was a new definition. And I'm going to read that one to you guys because I really, really like this one. And I think this is what we want you to take away from this conversation today, is this side of it and what that could look like for you. So the definition is bold courage born from self-trust. It's the willingness to take up space, to speak when silence is easier, to act when fear tells you to wait. It's not recklessness, it's intentional daring. Audacity lives in the gap between who you've been and who you're becoming, and it's the energy that lets you step forward anyway. It's the refusal to shrink, apologize, or wait for permission. It's saying, I'm doing it differently, and that's exactly the point.
I love that.
Same.
Okay, I love Audacity now. Bring it on. I'm okay with it now. So one thing you were saying earlier, and even in this definition, right, that stands out to me is you're not waiting for permission. It's unapologetic. And I think earlier you had commented on kind of, so what if other people don't like what you're going to say, right? So maybe you are a little more blunt or you are a little bit more bold. Where is mine? Because I think there truly are people that are blunt to the point they're just plain rude, right? Like I think that does exist, and that is not what we're talking about. So where does that line exist where you are a considerate person, you care about other people and how your words may impact them, but at the same time, you're not going to hold back your thoughts or what needs to be said because of that? Like, where is that? What does that balance look like?
I think it comes down to how you're doing it, right? Like you can say things to be blunt because you're being a jerk. I don't want to use the word that first came to mind. Right? So in case there's kids listening. So I think there are people who are just blunt because they don't really care, right? There's a lack of care. But I feel like doing it with audacity doesn't mean a lack of empathy and a lack of self-awareness and a lack of awareness for the conversation and how that might impact others, right? Like it's not just saying, screw you guys. It's saying, well, this is how I feel and I'm not afraid to share that. And I'm going to say it in a direct way, maybe, but just because I'm saying it directly does not mean an affront to you. It means this is how I feel. And to me, it's important to share what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling because what I'm thinking and feeling matters just as much as what you're thinking and feeling. And I think that's what a lot of women especially do is we hold back from saying what we think or feel because we are so afraid of what other people think, or we're so afraid of hurting their feelings, that we're being hard on ourselves and we're not allowing that to happen. So there is a fine line there. But I feel like if we don't say what we need to say, or if we don't do or take the risk a little bit, whatever it is, then we're hurting ourselves, you know? And so I think there is a line of being aware, being self-aware, but doing it because you deserve to say what you need to say or do what you need to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as you're saying that, it reminds me of my husband. He is more of a direct person. I feel like I've always been less direct growing up, and that's something I've worked to try to be a little bit more direct in my words and not sugarcoat things and just say what I need to say in relationships and work and whatever that may be. But I'm probably like way over here and he's probably way over here. So I remember very early, like college days, in our relationship where I feel like I kind of coached him on like, hey, some things you just like don't need to say. Or maybe like you can deliver that in a different way. You can say the same thing, but that could have an impact on someone. So I think a little bit, it might be a conditioning of like men versus women a little bit. At the same time, though, is not a mean person. He's very social and engaging in groups of people. And I've actually learned from him, there's been some situations where I was like, oh, I don't want to ask for that. I don't want to say that. And he's like, no, we should say that. And I've learned from him, I'm like, okay, yeah, no, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad we pushed for that or whatever it was. So it's really interesting because I feel like it's an interesting dichotomy there, but I feel like maybe we both learned from it, right? Because there's a difference between being direct and just saying what needs to be said versus being rude.
Right.
I like
You
that.
sent me a reel, I think earlier today, about people pleasing. And it was actually a really interesting interview, I think it was, with Kristen Bell, and
Yes.
where she was giving an example of where she was on a plane and she wouldn't ask for what she wanted because she just wanted to be perceived as nice and she didn't want to ask for too much. And I'm curious for you because I know we've talked about people pleasing quite a bit, and you sent me that reel. How do you feel like people pleasing and audacity kind of go together? Or where's that intersection and what does that mean for you?
So I think for people who tend to have people pleasing attributes, or maybe they're a recovering people pleaser, I think especially for that group of people, a way to have more audacity is to break out of that a bit. And one thing that Adam Grant said in that reel, which was interesting, he's like, but I forget the exact words, but he's like, but you're not being nice by people pleasing. You're more worried what they think of you. And that's not necessarily being nice. And so I think she wanted the coffee a certain way. It's asking for the coffee a certain way. You can always that's a easy example, right? That might feel easy to say, well, yeah, just ask for the one creamer instead of the two creamers. But I think just asking for what we need, you can always make the request. The answer might be no in certain situations, but we shouldn't just hold back and we're worried what they might think of our request. It's making that request. What do you need, and asking for it. I feel like that's a really good example of having more audacity for someone who's a people pleaser. And that journey might look a little different, right? For someone who's a people pleaser trying to be more audacious, but I think those little steps count.
That's what I was going to say too. It's like, I think it might come across like when we talk about audacity, it's like this big, huge, bold, risk, whatever. But for us, it's really the small things, is saying you want only one coffee creamer instead of two. Like that is an act of audacity. If that goes against kind of your people pleasing tendencies or whatever, it is like those small little changes that you make. And I feel like, and this is the case with a lot of habits, right? It's like the more you start doing it, the more comfortable it gets, the more you're able to start leveling up a little bit. And so it might start by asking for one coffee creamer instead of two. And maybe the next thing is you're starting to say no to, some requests that you don't want to do. Or maybe it's you taking and sharing online publicly that, it's like this progression of like, it can start with these small things and then it can get bigger, it can grow. But the point is just to start getting a little bit uncomfortable and to start taking some kind of action and to see how it feels, be aware, and then just start progressing from there. And I feel like that's how you can start to chip away at any of these types of things. You don't start big, huge. You start small, get a little confidence, get a little more comfortable, and then you just keep taking it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of starting small or doing, making these small changes, this is your word of the year. Where has it shown up for you in your life? When has it started to matter to you, or where has it really shown up?
So back in November, December, when I was thinking about this word, and I honestly can't remember like why in that moment I was like feeling a lack of audacity, I think. But I was just feeling a little bit like set in my ways, like a little too comfortable. And I like being comfortable, don't get me wrong, but I felt like a lack of growth maybe. And I felt like a little bit stagnant. And I felt like the more I sat in that comfort, the harder it was going to be to get out of it. And so I think that's kind of where this word came from. And so then I start talking with my girl, ChatGPT, about it. And I came up with this idea of 100 acts of audacity. And going back to what I was just saying, like a lot of these are very small things. Some of these are bigger, but the idea is to have these 100 things, this list of things that are going to get me a little bit out of my comfort zone and push the boundaries a little bit for me in order to live with more audacity. And so right away, before the year even started, I did start with a few things. For example, I got my very first tattoo, which was something that I had been wanting to do forever, but it really went against my like good girl rule following persona for me. I know that's not everyone feels that way. For me, it was really hard. And that's why I did it. And that was like, I did go big on that first one. I'm not going to lie. I'm not
I was
suggesting
gonna say
everybody
that's
does
not
that.
just a little,
I
that's a
know.
commitment.
As I was just saying, like start small. I got a tattoo, but that's on my bucket list, right? But that's not the point of this one. It is, I think for me, I wanted to start living with more audacity, and for me, having a visual reminder of that was a great way to set the tone and to do that. And so that's kind of where I'm at. I think I've done a good job. Probably have some room to grow as far as accomplishing this list, but it was helpful just to have ChatGPT help me like, hey, this is kind of what I want to do. Like, help me come up with some ideas. And so I definitely encourage I love Claude these days. I'm more of a Claude girl right now, but I suggest, if you need a little help, like talking to a friend or talking to your AI friend, that's okay too. And just start to get some ideas about what that maybe could look like for you. And I found that it's like getting me excited to do more things. Like even starting this podcast, I think for us, this is not related to our business we've had for the last 5 years of working with accountants, but it's something that we wanted to do because it was something important to us and it felt a little bit bold, a little bit risk taking. And I would say definitely is an example of us living with some audacity. And I'm curious for you, Ashley, I know when we were talking, you're like trying to think of really how this shows up for you and where you've seen it. And I know you're earlier in on your journey. And I want everyone to know like that's okay too. Like you don't have to be this super audacious person. If this is something that's important to you, you have to start somewhere. And so I'm curious, like, how does that resonate with you? Like, where are you feeling this in your journey?
Yeah. So that's a good point. You have to start somewhere. And what it means to be audacious could look really different for every person. And, we all have different personalities, different temperaments, different comfort levels. But to me, it's a little bit of getting out of your comfort zone almost, whatever that might be for you. That feels like a way to be more audacious, and everyone's comfort zone looks a little bit different. But I think for me, it is really the speaking up. And I talk a lot in the Rewrite Project about growing up kind of this yes person, a people pleaser, and just wanting to be easy, relationships to be conflict free. And just, I'm an Enneagram 9. I value peace. That's like my core need. And so for me, I feel like the most audacious thing is really speaking up, whether I have a need, whether I don't believe in something, whether something just is not right. And I think that showed up in the past with certain client projects. I remember a project many years ago where the audacity of the client to just assume we should be doing certain things or taking certain things on that were so far beyond the scope, not asking, but just assuming, telling us to do things, and that in the not positive way of audacity. But I remember speaking, I wanted to be accommodating for clients, and I think in some ways that's helped, but there is a line there. And so speaking up and kind of putting my foot down around that, saying, hey, that's really outside of the scope of this project. Here's some helpful information that you can look into that, but that's not included in the scope of our project. So I think that area has shown up a lot, and I think that's where I probably had a lot of growth in. But I think it's even just in my everyday life. This is such a silly example, but being someone who's just kind of like, go with the flow, whatever. Do you ever have a group of friends where someone's like, where should we go to dinner for a girls' night? Hey, where do you want to go? I feel like I say that all the time, right? And it's not that I have no opinions. Sometimes I truly don't care. I like a lot of different cuisines, so I'm less picky maybe. But it's kind of identifying the needs or opinions or whatever it is in the first place, and then voicing it versus letting it just be that autopilot, like whatever you want, it's fine. So I think, I don't know, we always talk about awareness, but being aware in those situations versus letting that autopilot happen and speaking up.
Yeah.
That's such a small example. It wouldn't hurt anyone for me to say, I'd like to go get some Thai cuisine or whatever, but it's just voicing needs and opinions, I think, whether someone likes those or not. And again, not in an inconsiderate way, but.
I actually really like that example because I think it's really easy to just say, well, I don't care, go with the flow, whatever, right? Like we're taught to go with the flow. We're taught to be easy and accommodating and all those things. But I always kind of come back in my head to, well, if she can have an opinion and say what she thinks, why can't I? And I always like when talking about awareness, like that is for me almost an automatic thought. And also for me personally, and maybe this will help others, I think I have my entire life relied on the being the go with the flow. And it kind of makes me a little bit mad to say like, well, that's stupid. Like, that's not fair. Why do they get to do what they want or say what they want or whatever? And I'm sitting here and I feel like I have to accommodate everybody else and their opinions. And it kind of gets me fired up every time I think about it, which is almost every time that situation or similar happens now. And so it did start with this awareness, and it's transitioned into this like little bit of a fire for me of like, I'm not going to be the quiet girl. I'm going to say what I need and what I want because I have a right to. And so it is like a practice in my head, I think, of like getting there. But that is taken. I mean, I remember the first situation for me as a senior in high school when we were getting ready for prom and talking about like what we wanted to do and da-da-da. And I remember first sitting there being, I don't care, whatever. And then over time, I don't even remember, something happened and I found myself just getting a little bit more like opinionated and whatever. And I think that was a little bit new for our group because I was not typically like that.
Yeah.
And
that can be shocking for people when they're not used to that. They're like, what? Who is this? But
I learned something from that of one, I can say what I need to say, this of how other people are used to me speaking up or not. But it kind of started to build that self-trust. And that goes back, I think, to that definition. It's that bold courage born from self-trust. And I think doing these things over and over, having that awareness, having that practice starts to build out that self-trust. If you don't have that, I think that's where it maybe gets to be performative a little bit, where you're just kind of maybe doing things because you feel like you should be the bold, loud one, but it's not really like coming from a place of self-trust or coming from a place of building your courage. It's coming from you're doing something because you feel like you have to. And I think that's like we were talking about the line earlier. I think that's another line of doing it in a way that is true to you and what you need and your own personal growth, and not being audacious because you heard a podcast where they talked about it and you feel like you should be. It is that line of not being overly performative, because that's not going to help you either,
That's a really good point. It's not like we have to be this contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian, or we have to demand we get our way and everything, because that's not life either. Like that's, we're not telling you to go be selfish and like not care about others and what they need either, right? Relationships are these two-way streets, and like using the silly example of a group of friends trying to decide where to go to dinner. Okay, maybe I voiced my opinion more, but I also really like a lot of different foods, right? So it doesn't mean, okay, now every time I'm a demand, we go where I go because that's my need. No, we have to do this because I want this, or no, there's still the role of compromise in relationships, and someone needs something and trying to accommodate where you can while respecting your own needs at the same time. And so not just doing it for the sake of feeling like you have to be bold, but doing it based on like what's true to you, what's inside, what you need, what you feel like needs to be said.
And on that same note, I think your values, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not just always about you and how you're feeling. Sometimes we need to have some audacity because you need to live out your values. And I can think of an example where, and I can't remember if I had shared this before, to be honest, but basically where I had to speak up in my community because there was someone that was causing some chaos. And so there were some issues and something had to be said. I didn't want to say something that was uncomfortable for me because I knew it was going to cause some kind of issues, and it definitely did. But my values were there in that something needed to change, something needed to happen. I needed to make sure that everyone in our community was feeling safe, okay, all these things. And so while I knew that I needed to have some audacity in order to do this, I really didn't want to. And I really felt like it definitely wasn't comfortable, any of those things, which is okay. But in order to live out my values and what's important to me, I had to go beyond what was comfortable, beyond my usual. And I had to do something that was really hard. And so I feel like we're talking a lot about like growth and internal and all these things, but I think there's a big external component to this of your values, but like how those play out in the broader context of, I love this example of, how you see these stories and it's like, you're in a board meeting and there's a woman and she explains her idea and everyone's like, okay. And then a man comes after her and he says the exact same thing. And everyone's like, yes, that was amazing. Great idea. Even though it's the exact same idea. Audacity in this situation might be a third person who's like, hey, isn't that what she just said? Right? Like the audacity of that is living out your values because you don't want to see that person, that woman who said this great idea, to be overlooked. It's not something that I'm doing for my own personal growth. I'm doing it because my values tell me that she deserves that. And I'm going to be real pissed if she doesn't get her recognition for it too,
That it's so funny as you're starting to give that example. I'm like, I know exactly where this example is going. But I think you make a really good point, because when it comes to our values, that's where I would say audacity matters the most, right? We've talked about a lot of examples, some really inconsequential, some much, much bigger deals. But I think to me, having audacity when it comes to your personal values is probably the number one, right? That's where it really matters.
Yeah, I think we've talked about like with our kids, right? Like both our kids have been in different situations where we've had to take some kind of action to protect them, to stand up for them, to go to the school and talk about things, whatever it is, like we've had to play that role in living with audacity, because if we didn't, what's going to happen? And I think that's another, like going back to the awareness, I think that's one last thing to think about for me is, if I don't do this, if I don't say this, what's going to happen? And what am I going to regret from it? And because a lot of times change won't happen unless we do something about it. And I think that's a good way to think about it too.
So before we wrap up, beyond maybe like looking at your internal values and how you can be audacious and protecting those values, we talked a lot about audacity today. What would you say women listening to this, what can they experiment with to have more audacity, or what can they take away themselves to really think about this in their own lives?
I think you're the queen of saying this. It's that awareness. Like, I just think that's so huge of like pausing in a situation to say, what's going on right now? How can I live with a little bit more audacity? And also, is there something that I'm holding myself back from? Because we know when we are, right? We feel that. And so I think if you're holding yourself back and you feel that and you don't want to come home with regret. Sitting there with empathy, self-awareness, and awareness in mind, think about what you might want to say and start there. I always used to write it down, like when I was in board meetings and whatever, I just write it down like a little note. And so that way I felt a little more confident, like I know what I'm going to say, I'm going to say it. And then it would sit there staring at me until I said it. And so I think that's just one example, but I think, just test it out, start getting comfortable and go from there. What do you think?
Yep, I love that. No, I think that's a perfect place. I wouldn't change anything there. I think writing that down and having awareness of where it matters to you. And I also love your list with Claude, where you, or ChatGPT, whatever it was, where you came up with ways that you can be more audacious. So I think doing something like that too could be a good starting point, and not to try to do everything, but kind of picking an area that feels like it matters the most to you. So with all of that being said, if this conversation resonated with you, head over to Substack, where we explore these ideas more deeply, and also inside the Rewrite Club, where these conversations continue. Think of it like an after dinner, conversation where women are navigating similar questions and kind of going through this growth together. So we'd love to have you there. You can find everything in the show notes, and we will see you next time.